Hello, I'd like to talk about some of my thoughts on Taylor Jenkins Reid. I've read two of her novels. I read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn and Hugo last year when it was sort of spreading across BookTube, and I thought that it was quite a good book. It explores things like race, fame, gender, queer identity. It tells the story of a classic old Hollywood movie star, her rise, her life, and her seven husbands. The writing is very simplistic, and I feel like I can't give adequate examples of that without spoiling some of the plot. And I'm not trying to imply that I like flowery writing or purple prose, because I really don't, and I will always rather something simple and direct over something obscured by elaborate language. But I think the best writers are those that can write directly, but still with a level of depth and nuance, such as Truman Capote or Harper Lee, Sarah Waters, Ray Bradbury, and I don't think Taylor Jenkins Reid gets to that level here. The writing style felt more comparable to YA. What Taylor Jenkins Reid does well, though, is her characters and her plot. That is what kept me interested, it's what kept me reading, but I still had this ever-present feeling that it could have been more. This is the sort of book that I enjoy while I'm reading it, but it doesn't stay with me after I've read it because it was lacking that level of depth. I also just finished reading Daisy Jones and the Six because I thought I'd try something different and actually read a book when it's being discussed. This follows a fictional band during the late 70s. One thing I think the book did quite well was depicting the creative process. I think showing how something is made, especially when it comes to music, since music is relatively abstract, except for maybe the lyrics, it's really hard to do well and make it feel genuine. I think this book did a pretty good job of it. However, I think the book got rather repetitive. I felt like it was hitting the same story beats over and over again. There was tension there, definitely, but there wasn't really any evolution or progression of that tension. It was the same conflicts, just sustained over the full story. And now I'll come to my main critique of this book. It was very obvious that Fleetwood Mac was a heavy inspiration for this book. And while there are quite a few particulars of the story that are different, it never elevated itself above Fleetwood Mac fan fiction. There were too many parallels, whole passages that were written about their album Aurora in the fictional album in the book could have been written about rumours. For example, I'll read this passage, it doesn't have any spoilers in it. Aurora was romantic and brooding and heartbreaking and volatile all at once. In the age of arena rock, Daisy Jones and the Six managed to create something that felt intimate even though it could still play to a stadium. They had the impenetrable drums and the searing solos. They had songs that felt relentless in the best way possible, but the album also felt up close and personal. Billy and Daisy felt like they were right next to you, singing just to each other. And it was deeply layered. That was the biggest thing Aurora had going for it. It sounds like a good time album when you first listen to it. It's an album you can play at a party, it's an album you can get high to, it's an album you can play as you're speeding down the highway. But then you listen to the lyrics and you realise this is an album you can cry to, and it's an album you can get laid to. For every moment of your life in 1978, Aurora could play in the background. I mean, that whole passage could have been describing rumours verbatim. And Daisy Jones is obviously a Stevie Nicks stand-in. I don't want to overstate the similarities because there are significant differences, but they felt insubstantial in comparison to the similarities of the band's broader story. The book itself was very readable. I read it in just a couple of days. I actually think it was even easier to get through than Seven Husbands, and it was enjoyable, but it never elevated itself beyond that. It never became bigger than the sum of its parts. I saw the writing, I saw the pieces, and I saw how they were stitched together. I don't begrudge anyone who likes this book or Seven Husbands. I get it, I see the appeal. There's a lot to like here, but there's just not enough to love. And depending on what her next publication is about, I may or may not read it. I don't know, it depends. I do appreciate having authors that I know I can rely on just having an easily readable, enjoyable story. And I'm afraid this review will come off more negative than I intend or how I feel. But the reason I wanted to say this is because these books are getting a lot of praise that I don't think is necessarily undeserved, but I haven't really seen the writing quality itself be discussed very much. So I just wanted to share my thoughts on them.